Hello everybody, welcome back to a brand new episode of Decoding the Unknown. As always, this episode brought to you by me. I read it. Ilza's written it. It's the walking statues of Rapa Nui, which is a pronunciation I definitely looked up before this. Now, normally I don't like to bother. That sounds like way too much work, doesn't it? But given that it's the subject of today's video, I thought it would be a good idea. Anyway, let's jump into it, shall we? Let's see what there is to decode, because I don't think statues can walk. As always, ready to be proven wrong. Don't think I will be. On the shores of a tiny, windswept island, 7 statues patiently gaze out over the open seas. In the distance, a tiny speck appears, bobbing up and down in the restless ocean. Slowly, the speck becomes 3, and finally, the 3 specks turn into 3 ships, fighting their way through the pounding waves. It'll be interesting to know who was more surprised, the 7 statues seeing really big and impressive canoes for the first time, or the crew aboard the 3 ships coming across this small island that up to that point no one knew existed, and being greeted by locals dressed in bright colours, and looming up behind them, really big stone heads. Tell you who wasn't surprised? The stone heads, because they're made of stone. They can't be surprised. Ever since that fateful Easter Sunday in 1722, when Dutch Admiral Jacob Roggeveen came across the tiny piece of land he creatively named Easter Island, the Western world has been captivated by the giant statues called moai that can be found all over the island. Roggeveen himself only stayed for 1 day. He was looking for a continent, Terra Australis, not another island, but his visit was the first of many visits to come. The past was... I always say the past was the worst, but the past in this case, kind of awesome. These, people out there exploring the world, and they're like, no, I'm not looking for some boring-ass island. I'm looking for a continent, mate. And it's like, today, I feel like all of the islands have been discovered, right? Because we have satellites. And it's like, there's no big secret island out there that no one's discovered that is actually awesome. What a disappointing time we live in.
My disappointment is immeasurable.
Today, thousands of tourists flock to the island to see the enigmatic moai, and researchers have spent years trying to figure out the secrets of the giant statues with limited success. Sadly, much of the history of the islanders, known as the Rapa Nui, and the story of the walking moai have been forgotten by a people that was nearly wiped out by multiple disasters that befell them. Let me guess, some of those disasters have got to do with that Dutch dude arriving. Because it's like, yeah, they're all getting on, blah, 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 blah. It's like, oh yeah, smallpox, the plague, all that horrible. And through all that, the moai have stood patiently watching the story of the island unfold. They've seen it all, they know all the secrets, but like most ancient gods, they have no intention of sharing. Not that they can. They're made of stone, Ilza! Now, just before we continue with today's video, let me tell you about our fantastic sponsor today. And if you can see all the shoes on my desk, that is because it's Vessi. Vessi are the only shoes that I wear. I once, in the last 2 years, wore a pair of leather shoes because I went to a wedding. Every other occasion... Oh, have I been to 2 weddings? Maybe I wore leather shoes twice. Look. Every other occasion, I am wearing Vessis. I have a whole selection of Vessis. This is the everyday classic. This one I actually hadn't had before. I've never had their classic pair of shoes, so I'm excited to get into this one. It looks actually very similar to... Hold on one second. It looks very similar to this one. This is my gym shoes. These are the ones that I wear to the gym every time. Very similar look. This is the Everyday 2, so just a slightly different style. These are their Chelsea boots. These are fantastic. I love these. These are actually new to me. Look at that. Look how nice that is. I have a grey pair of these that I've been wearing forever. Did I mention the best thing about Vessis is these are 100% waterproof? This isn't some water resistance thing. It is waterproof. If you put water on that, as you'll see in the B-roll, it just slides right off it like a duck's back. You could step in a puddle or a little stream or whatever, up to here, and your socks stay dry. It's incredible stuff. It's called Dymatex. There's also these are the Stormburst. There's so many shoes. All you need to do is go to vessi.com/DTU and you'll get 15% off your first purchase. There's free shipping to Canada, the US, Australia, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore. So check them out. They're fantastic shoes. I don't wear anything else. And yeah, thanks to Vessi for sponsoring. And now back to today's video. The Grand Moai. What makes Easter Island, or Rapa Nui as it's known by the locals, so unique are the statues. Close to 1,000 statues of different sizes have been found standing or lying down all around the island. Holy there are 1,000 of them? I thought there were like 5.
That's a lot.
Wow, okay. They were busy on that island making those statues. They're probably like, yeah, no, farming, nah. Hunting? Nah. Looking after our kids? Nah. Exploring? Nah. Building massive statues? Hell yes. Religion makes people do crazy. Like, people just spend, like, a large part of their Sunday in church worshipping the mystical sky god. And it's like, why? It's like a big waste of time, doesn't it? Oh, people are not going to like that. Through archaeological excavations and conservation efforts, some of the fallen statues have been returned to their platforms, but most of them are still buried up to their shoulders, leading to the mistaken belief that they're nothing more than heads. There's a body underneath them? It better be a tiny-ass body, because otherwise those statues are going to be buried deep. On average, a moai can weigh up to 80 tons and stand around 10 meters tall. However, that's 33 feet, by the way. You're welcome, Americans and old British people. However, my nan was always like, it's like 70 Fahrenheit outside. I'd be like, Nan, speak English. Tell it to me in Celsius, or if you're feeling old, centigrade. Fahrenheit is very 19th century, Nan. It's okay, she doesn't watch this show because she's dead. However, God, I didn't expect that joke to be quite so dark there. Don't know why that came out of my mouth, I apologise. But not to my nan, because she's dead. However, the largest moai found to date, El Gigante, sounds like a fat drug dealer, weighs around 150 tons and stands at an impressive 20 meters or 66 feet, with the slightest moai only standing at 1.13 meters or 3.7 feet. Some of the moai also wear a pakau on their heads. Hope you're going to explain to me what that is, Elsa, because I'm not very familiar. It's not like you... Yeah. Oh, welcome to the Gap, sir. What would you like? I'd like a pakau. I'd be like, I don't know what that is. No one knows what that is. The pakau is made from soft red stone and shaped like a hat, and probably represents some kind of headdress, or perhaps a top knot. The moai all appear to be male, though a handful of female moai have been found with an oversized head and similar facial features, a long sloping nose, deep-set eyes with a narrow mouth and a very prominent chin. The news that the statues had bodies took the world by storm in around 2012. Wait, we only discovered they have bodies in 2012? No archaeologists have ever been to Easter Island and be like, have we considered digging below them? See if there's anything down there, because isn't that like literally the job description of an archaeologist? Have a dig at the ground and see if anything's down there. Below a giant head would seem like a great place to look, archaeological community. However, it wasn't quite the grand discovery that the media made it out to be. Archaeologists studying the statues have known about the body since around 1914. Okay, good. Otherwise, I was about to think the whole archaeological community are just smoking crack instead of doing archaeology. The statues have been standing around the island for hundreds of years, so most are still buried in rocks and sediment, not sediment, that'd be very hard to be buried in, but rather sediment, which both hid but also preserved the bodies. It's not the full body though, it's just the torso and two arms. Apparently the statues didn't need legs to walk. Well, they wouldn't be walking, Ilza, would they? Because they're made of stone, Ilza! Each statue sits on a stone platform called an ahu, and an ahu can contain up to a dozen statues. It can? Oh my. The ahu is a raised rectangular platform made with large worked stones and a ramp paved with beach pebbles. The area in front of the platform is usually levelled. So far, around 360 of these platforms have been found. Research suggests that construction of these megalithic platforms probably started around the 13th century. The largest ahu found to date, and probably the most photographed of the lot, is the Ahu Tongariki, which contains 15 moai. In my mind, these are just scattered around the island and their heads poke out of the ground. I didn't realise there were so many, or they were clustered together like this. I'd say I'd like to go to Easter Island, but I know it's in the middle of nowhere. It's this is going to sound super ignorant, but it's close to New Zealand, right? Let's just Google Maps it, shall we? You can see this on the screen. I mean, not exactly what I'm seeing, but let's look up Easter Island. My thinking is it's somewhere off the east coast of New Zealand, somewhere in the Pacific. Oh God, it says it's near Chile. I'm thinking of Christmas Island. I'm thinking of Christmas Island. Why would you? I mean, it technically is off the east coast of New Zealand if you travel across the entire Pacific. Where is Christmas Island? Is that somewhere, or Cook Islands or some shit like that? Hey, look, the Cook Islands. They're where I imagined... What are we talking about today? Easter Island is. Where's Christmas Island? Is that even an island, or am I imagining that?
I don't know. That's a good question.
I don't know.
Christmas Island. Australian External Territory. That sounds more like what I'm talking about. Nope. I guess it was the Cook Islands or something. For a long time, one of my embarrassing geography things was I thought New Zealand is where Papua New Guinea was. I was like, yeah. I feel like it's because I played Risk as a kid, and Australia is divided into like Eastern Australia and Western Australia, and above it there was this other bit that I forgot the name of, and I always assumed that was New Zealand. Literally, I think I was in my 20s when I discovered that New Zealand was actually not there and was rather off the southeast coast of Australia. So that's a fun thing to discover. I'm learning all about geography today, but no, what you need to know is that Easter Island is off the coast of Chile, and I still think it does take a really long-ass time to get there, so no, I'm not going to go. I don't think I'll ever go there. It's too much travel for too little excitement. Like, if they were like, yeah, we got, like, adventures on Easter Island, I'll be like, dope. But just like to see some statues that I can look up on Google. I know it sounds super uncultured, but I don't really need to go and see those in person. Like, I think I'm the only person who's ever been to that Angkor Wat place and was like, yeah, it's alright, isn't it? I mean, it's quite good, but I wasn't desperately impressed. Sorry, that was a very long tangent. Let's carry on.
Next.
The statues stand with their backs to the ocean, looking inland, toward the people who made them. One exception is the 7 moai on Ahu Akivi. Legend goes that they face the ocean to help lost travellers find their way. Uh-oh. Be like, yo, Dutch lost traveller, over here, over here, over here. Oh God, you're full of diseases. Around 95% of the statues were carved at Rano-Raraku Quarry, an extinct volcano from the volcanic tuff, a porous stone formed from solidified ash. The native islanders didn't have metal, and the tuff, being a soft stone, would have been easier to work with their limited stone tools. These were basalt picks known as toki. The Rano-Raraku Quarry is home to statues in various stages of production, which gives us a good idea of how these statues were carved. There are also several completed statues still waiting patiently in the quarry for transport that will never arrive. I don't know, come on archaeologists, at least finish the job, grab those statues and pop them in a good place. I know that's not how archaeology works, but it's how I wish it worked. It's like, yeah, Leaning Tower of Pisa, prop shit up. What else is like broken? The Chinese Wall, the Great Wall of China, fix that shit. It's all falling down. Each statue was probably commissioned by a specific person or group and carved by a team of stoneworkers working under a master carver. They would start by quarrying a large rectangular block, first carving out the front and sides of the statues, gradually separating the back from the quarry rock. Once the basic figure was carved out, the master carver and his assistants would add some of the details. When this was done and the statue was separated from the quarry rock, it would be moved downhill and placed upright in a hole so that the master and his little helpers could finish the rest of the detailed work and the back of the statue. Finally, the statue was ready to move to its new ahu. Eye holes would only be carved once the moai arrived at its destination. Placing the pukao on the head became part of the process much later. It seems that the idea to put hats on the massive statues only started around the 15th and 16th century. These headdresses, with a diameter of up to 2 meters at 6.5 feet, Americans and my nan, weighing up to 12 tons, were quarried from the red stone at Prunapao Quarry before being moved to the statues to give them a chic new look. Once the hat was on and all the final details carved, eyes of coral would be added. Finally, turning the moai. Why would their eyes be made? Is there some sort of coral that I don't know? Coral to me is that like spindly stuff. How does that work as an eye? Finally, turning the moai into an Arinja aura, or a living face. And the process was complete. Despite the small size of the island and the fact that a little over 1,000 moai have already been found, new moai are still being discovered. The most recent was found in February 2023 in a dry lake bed. The sculpture is smaller than the other statues on the island, but it was an exciting moment for researchers who believed that there could be even more moai lying around the riverbed waiting to be uncultured. Again, the risk of sounding like super uncultured, it's like, yeah, what do you expect? It's like, yeah, there's going to be some buried underground. It was centuries ago. They're like, ooh, how exciting. Another statue. You found 1,000 of them. How exciting can it be? So I'm really selling this episode, aren't I? Why this little guy was in the lake in the first place is a bit of a mystery. However, moai loves company and apparently tend to travel in packs, so when there's one statue, there's probably more. And archaeologists just can't wait to go find the rest. Like, I think archaeology is cool sometimes. Also, other times you're going to be like, oh, God, that's boring. Like, what's your job going to be for the next few years? Literally just uncovering more of the same. You know, oh, look, a pot. Yes. The story of the statue builders. Who first settled the island is one of the many mysteries of the Rapa Nui. The small island, only around 163.6 square kilometers, that's 63 square miles, lies in southeastern Pacific Ocean, 2,000 kilometers from the islands of southeastern Polynesia, and around 3,600 kilometers away from mainland Chile in South America. there were miles conversions, but they're all just thousands. It's like far. Let's just say it's like two-thirds, roughly. That's a long way to paddle a canoe. While some argue that it's unlikely that early navigators and seafarers could have covered such vast distances without precision instruments, the Polynesians were amongst the world's first skilled seafarers, so they probably wouldn't have had any problem finding their way to Rapa Nui as it became known. When exactly they arrived is also up for debate, but it appears that once they arrived in their new home, they remained there in complete isolation. No one ever returned to the mainland, and no one from the mainland dropped in for tea. It's really far away. Like, I don't want to go there today, and we got planes. Although I have a feeling I have to take a boat there, don't you? Because there's no airstrip. Am I remembering that right? But then if thousands of visitors go, they're not all going to be getting on a boat for like a week, are they? Sounds pretty grim. And whenever I'm on those things, you know, whenever it's like, oh yeah, you do that, it's like you get on a boat for a week and you go to this island. It's like, what happens if I get sick? It's literally a week's back in the boat. Excavations at Anakina Beach in the Rapa Nui National Park show signs of early settlement in the form of charcoal, tools, and even bones. The researchers doing the excavations figured that this might be the original settlement. These finds were dated to around 1200, suggesting that this was when the people first arrived. However, a 1977 study analysing pollen claims that deforestation started as early as 800 CE, which meant that the new inhabitants arrived 400 years before Anakina Beach became home to a small settlement. Joanne van Tilburg, founder of the Easter Island Statue Project, oh, it's Joanne, he's going to dig up those riverbeds, isn't it? Also feels it's unlikely that the original settlers only arrived in 1200, considering that the locals were already building platforms by the 1200s, and there were signs of crop intensification, which would suggest that the Rapa Nui had been around for a while by that time. One thing that has researchers scratching their heads is how exactly the new settlers knew where to find the small islands. Did they know? Surely they're just like, I don't know, people in the past were like brave and they'd be like, let's go out exploring, get in the canoe, see where it takes us. And they go out into the Pacific Ocean, probably not realizing quite how big it is. They drift around for a while, they're probably super hungry and they're like, oh, thank God, an island. Let's go build some statues. It seems unlikely that a group of people loaded some canoes and just struck out blindly into the wide ocean in the hope of finding land. I mean, yeah, but like I said, they didn't really know how big all it was. They'd just be like, I can't, how far can it possibly be to the nearest island? And it's like, you don't have any idea how big the Pacific is, do you? And I can't blame them. It was the past. They didn't know shit. However, if you ask some native Rapa Nui Islanders, they have a pretty good idea of how it all went down. Wait, there are actually native people still living there today? And I thought, wasn't the island like super deforested and barren? And now it's just like a wasteland with statues? Benedicto Tuki, an islander who has since passed on, claimed to be a descendant of the island's first king, Hotu Matua, and his grandmother was the last queen of the island. According to tales told to him, Hotu Matua brought his people from Hiva, an island in the Marquesas, due to fighting there. He arrived on the island with 7 different races, who then became the 7 different tribes of Rapa Nui. How many people are there? 7 different tribes arriving by canoes? I don't feel that's realistic. Hotu Matua knew where to go because his tattooist and priest, Hua Maka, had seen the island in a dream and described it in great detail. Okay then, well we know that's not real. Hotu Matua decided that the island was the ideal home to settle his people and set sail in canoes loaded with people, food, water, plant cuttings and animals, everything a group of settlers would need to survive. They sailed across the seas for 2 months before finally arriving at Anakina Bay, finding the island exactly the way the tattooist saw in his dream. However, this is just one version of how the islanders came to the island. Other stories tell of 7 explorers sent out by Hotu Matua to find the islands. Like many island cultures, the Rapa Nui history was passed down from one generation to the next in the form of stories and songs, which, while entertaining, is not a brilliant way of recording history. So it's not surprising that the stories evolved. We storytellers love to add our own spin to each tale we tell. However they got there, the island the new arrivals found themselves on was beautiful and rugged, but without the abundance of natural resources you'd usually expect to find on a tropical island. The soil is still not well suited to agriculture, and fresh water is scarce as the island has no permanent freshwater streams. Bro, I mean, it's a small island, but it's still fairly large as islands go. And there's no permanent freshwater streams? That sucks. You'd be like, oh no, this isn't the island I want. There's nothing to drink. Unlike most other islands, there are also no large coral reefs offshore and no lagoons. However, despite these limitations, the Rapa Nui still managed to grow some staples like yams, sweet potato, and sugarcane, and while they couldn't feast on shellfish, the fishing around the island is pretty good, so they probably had enough food to go around. At first, all was well. Now, there are 2 versions of what happens to the Rapa Nui people. One is a cautionary tale of what happens to the environment when people start getting greedy and overpopulate and overwork their lands. It's good we've all learned that lesson. Easter Island sported forests of palm trees for thousands of years, possibly as many as 16 million trees, with some standing 30 meters high. Well, that's a hell of a lot of trees, which means a hell of a lot of coconuts. And if you crack those bad boys open, you know what's inside? Drinkable, delicious coconut water. When people first arrived, they needed fire to cook, and they needed to clear land for farming, which led to large parts of the forests being chopped down and burned in order to clear the land. Once they started building the moai and the ahu, they needed timber for construction and possibly for moving the statues. Of course, once the trees were gone, the soil eroded and cut down all of the trees already? The birds packed up their stuff and set off for distant lands, or just died out. They probably died out. Unless they're like migratory birds, they ain't making that flight. Right? Regular ass birds don't fly that far. Like, I've seen a chicken, it can barely move. And I guess that's not a brilliant example because we've ruined chickens so they taste delicious. But can a regular bird like a sparrow or some fly really far? I get the feeling the answer's no, right? Although I don't know how many sparrows are on Easter Island. And without trees to build shelter and, more importantly, canoes for fishing, life on the islands became difficult, and soon the population was faced with widespread starvation. However, some researchers feel that this isn't an accurate portrayal of what happened on the island. Humans can be very destructive, we've proven that many times over, but researchers Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo weren't convinced that the settlers alone could have caused so much damage. Whenever I see someone with the surname Hunt, all I desperately want is for their first name to be Michael, and it never is. Because why would you name your son Michael if your surname is Hunt?
Good point.
The discovery of rat bones might solve that mystery. When the people arrived, they brought with them the Polynesian rat, either as a food source or unintentionally in the form of ratty stowaways. With an unlimited food supply in the forms of delicious palm trees and no natural predators other than those pesky humans, it was rat heaven. You know what rat heaven means? Lots of delicious rats, yes! With rats munching down on the seeds and eventually the new saplings, it became impossible for the palm forests to regenerate. Add people chopping down trees and rapid deforestation becomes inevitable. The reports by early European explorers seem to support this version of events. In Roggeveen's reports of the islands, the moai were still standing and he estimated the population to be around 8,000. When Captain Cook arrived in 1774, he reported that there were no trees over 10 feet tall, and he estimated that the population was around 700. Oh my, that's quite a substantial loss, isn't it? In 1821, Captain Thomas Raine, sailing out of Australia, reported that the inhabitants of the island swam out to meet the ship and there wasn't a canoe inside, thus confirming reports of a lack of seaworthy canoes. However, these early accounts aren't always reliable. Only 12 years after Cook's visit, another explorer, Jean-François de La Pérouse, estimated the population of Rapa Nui to be between 2,000 and 3,000 people. So either Cook or de La Pérouse had a bit of trouble with numbers and counting. Yeah, it's a fairly substantial difference. I mean, maybe one guy was just like, oh no, I just went to one village, 700 people, but most people lived in the city around the corner. I mean, it doesn't seem very likely. Maybe it was just shit counting. The picture of the Rapa Nui destroying their land with a helping paw from the rats was accepted for many years. But how true is this really? Archaeologists love to disagree about things, and some state the island population might have been up to 15,000 or even 20,000 people at its peak. However, the poor soil and lack of fresh water would have been limiting factors, so a population explosion is unlikely. The population probably remained steady at 3,000 people from the mid-1300s until the arrival of the Europeans in 1722. Recent research also suggests that the deforestation happened gradually, not overnight, and there's even evidence that attempts at reforestation were made. However, even with the trees gone, the people adapted to their environment and were still healthy, happy, and according to some research, still building ahu and moai to stand on them by the time the Europeans set foot on the island. Once the Europeans arrived, however, things started going downhill fast as the population was decimated by diseases like smallpox and also the slave trade. Oh, I was like, wait, the slave trade was a disease? And I'm like, no, two separate things, Simon. Use your big brain. Instead of taking photos and buying souvenirs, the Europeans simply bagged the locals to sell on the slave markets. By 1877, the once proud people had been reduced from 3,000 to 111. A few articles claim that the people who built the statues have all vanished, and what happened to them is a big mystery, but that's not true. The Rapa Nui is a resilient people, and today the population stands at 2,000 native Rapa Nui to a population of 7,000 people living on the islands. Okay, so people do live here, on this decimated island. Based on their oral traditions, we know the Rapa Nui who built the statues were living We're a complex society with chiefs, priests, and aristocracy, but also a people who took great pride in their work. Many of the lower caste became master craftsmen, carvers, divers, and canoe builders in their own right. Many of the crafts, song and dance of the great statue builders are kept alive by their descendants. So much like the statues, the people lived through some difficult times, but they're still very much alive and kicking. I have to say that's not what I expected. I really thought the whole island was just like devastated by deforestation and no one could live there anymore because it's just barren. I guess not. The big question, why were the Moai made? Carving and then moving the huge Moai took some time, so it stands to reason that if you're going to be making very large statues, you probably got a good reason, right? Yeah, well, I mean, sort of. You think it's a good reason, but it's not a good reason, and my bet is it's sky gods. Unfortunately, we're not really sure what that reason was, but as always, we have some theories. Throughout history, large statues have often had some kind of religious or ritual purpose. According to Rog, even when he arrived on the island in 1722, he found the native islanders praying and performing rituals to honor the Moai. He noted in his ship's log that the people of the island didn't appear to be carrying weapons, which must have made his colonizing heart just beat a bit faster, but instead they appeared to rely on their gods or idols, standing along the seashore in great numbers for protection. You're going to be like, as a colonizer, you'll be like, excellent. Idiots think the gods are going to protect them. Only my god is right. Like many other ancient cultures, the Egyptians come to mind, and the Rapa Nui believed their chiefs and rulers were descended from gods. After death, the chief would again reach divinity. The statues were meant as temporary housing for the spirits of their ancestors to keep the spirits safe until an apartment opens up and they can move on to the next plane. Either that or the statues were meant to capture the spirit and keep it safe so that it could continue to help the tribe. Archaeologists have discovered human remains at some of the Ahu, which further support the idea that these were sites for death rituals. This is also why statues needed to resemble humans, as they were used to honor the dead. Instead of just remembering the revered ancestors, the people wanted a physical image to represent each chief, so the theory goes, the Moai are the faces of the dead ancestors. The first statues were smaller, but eventually they started getting bigger. This could be due to mana, an important concept in Rapa Nui beliefs. Mana is a sacred and spiritual power that comes from divinity and is channeled to the people from those who are descendants of the gods themselves. It's the divine life force, the source of energy responsible for fertility of the earth and seas. So, researchers believe a larger statue meant that the chief who ordered it had more mana. The chief next door saw this and, in a classic case of keeping up with the Joneses, decided to make an even bigger Moai to have even more mana and power, and so on, leading to some of the huge Moai standing and lying around the island today. Another theory suggests that since the statues had religious significance, any disaster that befell the island was met with a bigger statue. A disastrous crop failure led to an even bigger Moai to honor and please the ancestors and gods so that they'd provide a better harvest next time. Yeah, again, this is exactly the case of they think it's brilliant and exactly what they should be doing, but objectively it's a terrible idea and they should instead be using that money to, I don't know, make weapons to actually keep away the Dutch, or make, crops so they don't starve to death, or maybe just stop chopping down the jungle. However, anthropologist Carl Lipo doesn't believe that the statues represent ancestors. The statues are very generic, and while the features are exaggerated, the statues don't seem to have specific defining features, like you'd expect to find on a statue carved to honor a specific person. Think of the Greek and Roman sculptures of important figures like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, or the Egyptian statues of pharaohs. There are also no ahus or statues found on top of hills, a place where you'd expect a monument to be built, especially if it's supposed to be symbolic. Another possible explanation is that the statues are competitive in nature, considering the variety in size. According to legend, there were originally 7 tribes, but today there are about 36 different clans on the island. With a variety of culturally distinct and separate clans or tribes, the statues could have served as status symbols, essentially the ancient equivalent of a fancy new car, a big house, or, in South Africa, a tennis court in your backyard. Oh, is that the flex? I heard in Australia it's balconies. British people were not very flexy. I mean, I don't think, are we? I don't know. Are we? I guess we do drive fancy cars and such things. But I don't know what that would be. I guess big house. Like big house. Tiny house in London. The larger the statue, the more resources, especially in the form of labor, went into making it, proving that a particular tribe was flourishing. If you can afford to spare men to carve statues instead of farming or fishing, well, you're doing very well indeed. Considering the limited resources on the island, you'd expect conflict. However, there isn't much evidence for prolonged and particularly lethal warfare. There are no fortifications on the island, and while skeletons with clear signs of injury have been found, those injuries were rarely lethal. So perhaps the islanders were smart enough to realize their small population couldn't sustain extended warfare, and instead of killing each other by the hundred, they engaged in territorial displays by building more and bigger moai than the tribe just down the road. Yeah, I don't know if I really believe that one, because at some point they're going to be like, yeah, but if we murder the tribe down the road, there's going to be more resources for us, and also they're going to be building no moai at all, not even tiny ones. Personally, I think trying to make better art than the other fellow is a far more civilized form of warfare, and the Europeans should have been taking notes instead of selling the locals into slavery. Completely agree if it's true, but I don't think it's true. HOLLiiWOOD, however, believed that the moai were used as landmarks of sorts, indicating where to find valuable resources. After mapping the exact locations of the moai, Lipo and his team discovered that the moai were often located next to important resources like workable land for agriculture, fresh water, or good fishing spots. Doesn't that also just mean it's where the people were going, like in general? So they'd be like, that's a nice place for a moai, isn't it? Because we're just fishing here, one afternoon, and Bob was like, you want to build one of those moai? And they're like, yeah, let's put it over there, rather than some random place we never go to. However, for the most part, the statues were found close to a fresh water source suitable for humans. Fresh water is an incredibly valuable resource on the island, as the island has no permanent streams, and there's no real evidence that the natives relied on the lakes, as the lakes and springs were sitting atop volcanic cores. They were hard to reach and far away from settlements, so it's unlikely that they were used as a steady water supply. Rainfall was unpredictable, and when it rained, the rain would drain into aquifers. The groundwater would then seep into the caves and appear in streams on the coast. Lipo and his team first noticed these freshwater streams on the coast when they saw horses drinking from what appeared to be the ocean. As we all know, drinking seawater is a bad idea, and horses aren't stupid, so they probably weren't drinking the seawater, which is how the researchers discovered the brackish streams that provided the locals with drinking water, according to historical records. Some of the Ahu were found without an obvious fresh water source close by, but historic wells indicate that the locals would make a plan to get water and dug wells. Considering the time and effort involved in carving a statue and transporting it, the statues were probably not used as markers to indicate, find your fresh water here. However, fresh water is vital for drinking and farming, so it makes sense that these spots would be considered important and possibly even sacred, making it an ideal spot for a moai, the embodiment of a sacred ancestor. But again, I'll just say, also, if you're erecting a massive statue, even if you've carved it elsewhere, it's going to be quite a lot of effort to kind of put it up and all of that stuff. You'd want to do it near a water source rather than far away, because lifting statues is going to be thirsty work. The Ahu and moai found near fresh water sources might also have been used to show that it belonged to a specific tribe or clan. In true competitive fashion, the size of the moai, or perhaps some of its features, would indicate the quality of the water. The higher the status and the bigger the competitive advantage. However, it's possible that the moai were more than just religious icons and served a practical purpose, perhaps without the islanders themselves being aware of it. According to a study by Joanne van Tilburg, the moai was believed to improve agriculture, which made them critical to food production. Van Tilburg's team, which includes geoarchaeologist Sarah Sherwood, has spent around 5 years studying 2 moai excavated at the Rano Raraku quarry on the eastern side of the island. The statues were found upright, one on a pedestal and another in a deep hole, suggesting that they weren't awaiting transport to a new location. The researchers also found crescent shapes and other figures carved into the backs of the statues, and a carved human head was found resting against the base of one of the statues. It's possible that these statues were meant to stay where they were, in the quarry, and served a ceremonial purpose, possibly to ensure a good harvest, because, as it turns out, Rano Raraku was also very productive farmland. After testing soil samples, it became clear that the area around the Rano Raraku quarry was producing foods like banana, taro, and sweet potato. Sherwood believes the soil at Rano Raraku is probably the richest on the island, and is also adjacent to a fresh water source, which made the land ideal for farming. The quarrying of the statue seemed to have further boosted the fertility of the soil, while other soil on the island was being eroded away or leached of elements for plant growth, the smaller fragments of bedrock raining down from the constant quarrying and carving of the statues provided the soil with elements like calcium and phosphorus, which is vital to agriculture. The combination of small bedrock fragments and fresh water created a perfect feedback system, providing the soil with water and natural fertilizer. Similar research done by Mara Mulroney found that the Rapa Nui people would place basalt pebbles cobbles and boulders in the mulched gardens they kept for cultivating yams, sweet potato, and other crops. The stones would trap moisture and the boulders protected the plants from the winds, but the weathering of the rock also allowed minerals to leach into the soil, boosting nutrient levels and thus improving yields. In a good example of the divine used to explain science, the Rapa Nui farmers probably didn't realize it was the minerals from the rock shards leaching into the soil improving their harvest, rather ascribing the great harvest to divine intervention. It's basically where religion comes from. Super interesting. Unfortunately, much of the Rapa Nui oral tradition has been lost, and while we have many theories, even the descendants of the Rapa Nui still living on the island today don't know why exactly the statues were made. Making large idols containing the spirits of your ancestors and placing them near valuable water and fertile land, inadvertently making the land more fertile, seems like the most likely explanation. However, I quite like the idea of people making big statues to show superiority rather than making spears and killing other people. Yeah, I like the idea, I just don't think that it's very likely. The end of the Moai. Jacob Rogeven and his crew reported that when they arrived on the islands in 1722, the statues were still being used by the locals for rituals and religious practices. However, when James Cook arrived in 1774, he found the giant statues in ruins. If the Moai were such an important part of Rapa Nui culture, why did the islanders stop making them? While the Moai standing on their platforms were still in use by the time the first Europeans arrived, archaeologists believe that the Moai carving practice reached its peak by the 1500s. However, from the 1600s, things started going in a different direction. According to a local Rapa Nui historian, one of the possible reasons for the end of the Moai was the deforestation of the island. Dwindling resources meant the islanders were spending more time building and cultivating specialized rock gardens and gathering what limited resources they could get their hands on, leaving less time for carving and transporting the huge statues all over the island. On top of that, if they needed logs to transport the Moai, the lack of trees would have made the transportation much harder or even impossible. If the population further declined due to a lack of resources, the Rapa Nui people simply wouldn't have had the manpower necessary to continue carving and moving the Great Moai. Alternatively, deforestation and lack of resources could have led to societal collapse, with the resources on the island dwindling, the people were starving. As one researcher pointed out, when you make idols, you're going to create the ideal. The early Moai were thinner, but the later ones had great curved bellies. The people were starving, so they made their idols big and fat. When they finally ran out of resources, they not only stopped carving the Moai, but even toppled their idols, perhaps thinking that their ancestors had perhaps abandoned them, or in anger as an act of taking power away from the ancestors who weren't willing to help their people. Eventually, people started killing each other for what resources remained. See, you get there eventually, you know. It's like, yeah, we're making better Moai than you. And it's like, yeah, but when the resources run real thin, humans just gonna human, you know. Obsidian spear points found in a layer of subsoil would seem to support this theory, and even among the islanders themselves, there are tales of cannibalism and general carnage. However, the islanders don't seem to think any less of their ancestors. After all, it was desperate times and all that. Later years saw the rise of the Birdman cult. Rapa Nui didn't have a whole lot of mammals or reptiles, and by the time the island was properly deforested, the only thing in abundance was seabirds, probably nesting on safer offshore rocks and small islands. So, eventually, as is the nature of all creatures and their beliefs, the Rapa Nui began to consider the birds as more sacred, and decided that rather than stone statues, their ancestors were keeping an eye on them from above, in the form of feathery friends. With the ancestors moving from stone statues to birds, there was no longer a need to carve statues for the spirits of the ancestors to reside in. After all, their new homes came with wings and spectacular views. If only they'd done that previously. If only they'd be like, yeah, they're in the birds. They're in the birds, sure. And then they wouldn't have destroyed, or possibly destroyed their island, making giant, pointless statues. It's possible that those still praying to the Moai, as reported by the early Europeans, were just the last of the Moai cult, stubbornly clinging to their stone idols, while the rest of the islanders had given up on the Moai and turned their gazes to the skies and were following the Birdman cult. Not all the Moai were toppled intentionally. Some have fallen down due to an earthquake, while many fell over due to neglect or other environmental factors once the focus shifted to birds. By the mid-1800s, not a single statue was still standing. Wait, are they all knocked over, or did some archaeologists come along and prop them up again? There's none of them? There were thousands! The walking statues. While many of the Moai made it to their final resting place, nearly 400 statues are still awaiting transport at Rano Raraku Quarry. That means that only a third of the statues reached their final destination. We're not sure quite why so many of the Moai never left the quarry. Perhaps moving the larger stone statues just wasn't that easy. Moving the giant heads without breaking the detailed features like the nose and lips would have been quite the challenge, and some broken statues lying at the bottom of slopes indicate that transport didn't always go smoothly. Yeah, it's a pretty good indication, isn't it? So how exactly do you move a stone statue weighing a couple of tons if you're not Egypt and you don't have the manpower? If local legends are to be believed, the statue simply walked. Well, we could not believe those local legends here at Decoding the Unknown because it's obviously nonsense. The word neke neke in the Rapa Nui language literally means walking without legs, and according to the stories, that's exactly how the statues moved. Those who possessed mana or divine power could command the Moai to walk from the quarry to their final home. According to legend, only a select few people had enough mana to make the statues move, either by commanding them or by reciting magical chants. One myth tells the story of Ukoihu, a popular chief and powerful man whose mana was so great that when he told the statues to walk, they not only walked, but walked to places of their own choosing, deciding for themselves where they wanted to spend eternity. Another tale claims that the greatest god of the island, Makamake, was the one who commanded the statues to move. Wasn't that the name of that? Wasn't that the name of an asteroid? Wasn't there some asteroid that came past called Makamaka? Make. I don't know how to pronounce it, but something like that. Why have I'm beginning to think now that it begins with an H. So I don't think it was that. But I know that name from somewhere, and I don't know why. If you couldn't get a hold of a great chief or the great god, all was not lost. Priests could chant the statues into place. However, if the priests stopped chanting, the statues stopped moving. Some of the statues never made it because an evil spell halted their march, leaving them stranded by the side of the road. Evil spells were also used to topple the standing statues. Apparently, there was an old woman working as a cook for the sculptors who had enough mana to command the statues to walk. When the image makers, as they were called, refused to share their meal, she ordered the statues to fall down. Moral of the story: don't mess with the cook. However, it seems that the statues could only walk after dark. That must have been quite a sight and probably not something you'd want to run into unexpectedly on a dark and lonely night. Well, good news, everybody, you're not going to have to, because obviously it's not real. For some inexplicable reason, scientists don't want to accept the theory of the statues walking around the island in the dark, and they have some more practical theories to explain how the statues were moved. Ah, yes, my favorite part of the episode. It's like, I like magic. I really enjoy magic shows and stuff, and there was no show I liked more, like magic thing.
Oh my god.
It's magic.
Oh my god.
Then it was called Uncovering the Magician's Code or something. It must have been like a TV show from or The Masked Magician. Was it called The Masked Magician? And it was just this dude who was a magician, and he'd do the trick, and then he'd reveal the secrets of the trick. And it's kind of like, oh, well, that's a bit boring, but it's also awesome. I love knowing the trick. One theory suggests that the statues were moved by rolling logs or possibly using wooden sleds pulled with ropes, similar to how the blocks were moved for building the Great Pyramid at Giza. Joanne Van Tilburg and her team managed to move a 10-ton replica using a sledge moved with eucalyptus rollers and a team of 60 people. This is certainly a plausible method, but 60 people are still a lot if you have a small tribe. However, according to a study done in 2012, the old legends might have some truth to them. Really now? How so? I feel, yeah, they could walk, but they'd just be pushed along or rolled or something, right? Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo decided to give the story of walking statues some consideration. Unlike the ancient Egyptians, the islanders couldn't spare too many people to carve and move statues. Cultivating food and finding water were far more important to the people's survival. So, what if they walked a statue from the quarry to the Ahu by rocking the statue from side to side in the same way that you would move a fridge? Basically, such a specific example, but I know exactly what you're talking about, Ilza. Based on the breakage patterns of the statues that didn't quite make it from the quarry to their final home, it became clear to the researchers that the Moai were standing upright before they fell, which meant that they weren't being pulled along vertically on rollers and sledges. The base of the unfinished statues in the quarry, as well as the ones lying on the sides of the road, was wider than those sitting on Ahu. The unfinished statues also leaned forward by about 17 degrees, so the center mass is positioned just over the rounded bottom edge. This allows the statue to roll from side to side. However, leaning so far forward means they wouldn't have been able to stand by themselves, they would tip over. Lipo theorized that the statues were modeled on how people walk. Essentially, you rotate your hip and fall forward, so the Rapa Nui designed a statue that did the same thing. This is the theory that I feel I've heard of, and is the one that I just find the most likely. And that these, who is it? Lipo and the other chap? Lipo and Hunt have cracked this. It would rotate and fall forward, moving step by step. Even the paths on the island seem to support this theory. After studying the paths leading from the quarry to the Ahu all over the island, the team concluded that the concave paths were designed that way to make it easier for the statue to walk. The moai was probably guided using ropes by a team on either side of it and a small team behind it to steady the movement. Walking the statue would require a much smaller team than dragging it on a sled. Once the moai arrived at its Ahu safe and sound, the final touches would be added and the base reshaped to adjust the center mass, allowing the statue to now stand upright without assistance. However, the statues weren't the only things that needed moving. When hats became all the rage in the world of statue fashion, the heavy pukao needed to be moved from the quarry to the statue. They were a lot smaller, the largest only reaching a diameter of around 2 meters, so moving them might have been tricky but not impossible. Getting the headdress onto the statue's head was a different story. One way they could have done this is a ramp and rope technique known as par buckling. A rope would have been tied around the pukao or hat, and people would have pulled it up a ramp toward the top of the head. It would probably have been easier to pull than push. Research shows that it's perfectly feasible for around 15 people, or fewer depending on the size of the pukao, to pull the pukao up a ramp and place it on top of the statue's head. Unfortunately, due to time, weather erosion and other factors, the hats have long since fallen off, and only a few of the excavated moai can now be seen sporting their fashionable red hats. Of course, where you find amazing feats of human engineering, you find aliens! Yes! It's never a Decoding the Unknown episode if aliens don't get involved. According to Eric von Daniken, oh god, a name I know so well, spouting his, in my opinion, allegedly nonsense theories. He's the guy who wrote Chariots of the God and right, who studied the Egyptian pyramids and the giant geoglyphs in Peru. The work is too detailed to have been done with the stone tools, and it was done by aliens. A small group of aliens found themselves stranded on Easter Island. Of course they did. Though how they managed to do that is unclear. And in an attempt to signal their alien buddies looking for them, they built these huge stone statues with distinct human features and placed them all around the island. Because if your alien comrades are looking for you, they're going to be looking for large human heads. That makes perfect sense. Yeah, perfect sense, like all of Eric's other ridiculous theories. Conclusion. Perched on their platforms, or half buried beneath the ground of Rapa Nui, the moai are still keeping a watchful eye on their people. They may have been replaced by a birdman cult in the distant past, so I'm thinking they're probably not fond of birds, but they're the objects of a new kind of worship. Despite not being the easiest travel destination to reach, their visitors are plenty. They may not be considered the source of fertility for agriculture, but they're still looking after the island and the people on it by luring tourists and the money that comes with them. Not something the birds are really doing. We'll probably never know why exactly they were built or how they were moved, but I like to imagine these large statues lumbering across the island, slowly making their way to their platforms to settle down and spend eternity in contemplation. Who knows? Perhaps they're still walking on the darkest nights when no one is watching, bestowing manna on their people and trampling a few seagulls along the way. They're not, because as I said many times, they're made out of stone! And that's where we end today's episode of Decoding the Unknown. Thank you for being here. Welcome to a realm where logic spirals into enigmatic puzzles, where the answers are as elusive as the questions themselves. Nice on episode of The Twilight Zone. Today we're venturing into the world of paradoxes. At the forefront is the notorious liar paradox, a puzzle that will twist your perceptions of truth and deception, but that is just the beginning. Stay with us today, because later in the video we're going to look at the bootstrap paradox, which is utterly mind-bending. Let's get into it. The liar paradox dates back thousands of years to the ancient Greeks, if not earlier. There are many variations of this paradox, but the most simple version is a single sentence. This statement is false. If the statement itself is false, then it would mean that it is actually true, and if the statement is true, it would mean that it is actually false. This means that whether you believe the statement to be true or false, it would be both true and false at the same time, which should be a logical impossibility. Early attempts to reconcile this paradox suggested that the statement simply was neither true nor false, which resulted in the strengthened liar's paradox. For example, the paradox could be rewritten as either this statement is not true, or this statement is only false. The first variation was designed to preclude the possibility that the statement was neither true nor false, and the second was designed such that it couldn't be both true and false. The paradox gets its name from the earliest accounts of the paradox, such as from Greek philosopher Eubulides of Miletus, who posed the paradox in the 4th century BC as, quote, "A man says that he is lying. Is what he says true or false?" While it may seem like a somewhat nonsensical paradox focused on semantics, language was built on classical binary truth value. Every statement must be either true or false. There have been numerous attempts to resolve the paradox, but unless someone is willing to just dismiss it as pointless nonsense, no such resolution can yet be found. This particular paradox is also proven to not just be completely pointless, having played a large role in mathematics. Self-referential paradoxes are easy to create in semantic language, but it was believed that such things didn't exist in maths. I have a question for all of you men out there. Does anyone like having things like acne, blackheads, dead skin on your face? No! Of course you don't. Everyone likes having clean skin. Everyone wants to be their best self. And if you don't, well, today's sponsor, T. Shanley, isn't for you, but for everyone else in the world, which is like 99.999% of you, T. Shanley is for you. Their goal is to help keep your skin fresh and clean, creating a routine for you to follow in order to deal with any unwanted skin blemishes. And on top of that, it's unbelievably easy to start and keep up with only a few clear steps to keep your skin clear and healthy. Honestly, it is the best skincare system for guys like you and me, plus it is super affordable, it doesn't break the bank, and it has over 7,000 5-star reviews on their website from satisfied customers all around the world. From face washes to moisturizers to exfoliating scrubs, they come with basic ingredients and steps that anyone can follow, and on top of that, every box comes with an instruction card that tells you when to use each product, how much to use, and in what order. They really make the process of achieving and maintaining amazing skin easy. And because T. Shanley is sponsoring today's video, they're offering you guys a great deal. Just click the first link in the description and you'll get 30% off your first box, plus a free gift. Don't miss out on this amazing deal. Click that link and get started. Thank you, T. Shanley, for sponsoring today's video. And now back to it. In 1901, mathematician Bertrand Russell discovered the set theory paradox, that the set of all sets that are not members of themselves cannot exist. Now, if you're unfamiliar with set theory, it's not actually terribly important. What matters is that it was a mathematical rephrasing of the liar paradox, as the set of sets that did not include themselves would have to simultaneously include and not include itself, which is impossible. This was extended by Kurt Gödel in 1930 to create his incompleteness theorems. By showing that a self-referential liar paradox could be written as a formal arithmetic statement, Gödel proved that no system of mathematics could ever be complete. While it's unusual for a paradox to have practical applications, Gödel's incompleteness theorems and his proof that no consistent formal system of maths can prove its own consistency is regarded as one of the greatest intellectual achievements of modern times. The bootstrap paradox gets its name from the phrase pulling oneself up by the bootstraps. While the meaning of that phrase has changed over time, the saying was originally intended to refer to something that was ludicrously impossible. After all, when confronted with a massive wall or fence, a person could not simply grab their bootstraps and pull on them to lift themselves over the barrier. There are many forms of this paradox, so we'll look at one of the more popular versions. Let's imagine a person who was both a huge fan of Albert Einstein and who also has access to a time machine. This person takes a copy of Einstein's theory of relativity, then travels backward in time to meet Einstein before he had begun work on his theory. The time traveler uses his book to teach Einstein about relativity before returning to his own time. Einstein then goes on to publish the work as his own, never making any reference to the time traveler. His work gets published repeatedly over the coming decades or even centuries until a copy of it finally winds up in the hands of our time traveler. So where did the theory of relativity actually come from? Einstein learned it from the time traveler, but the time traveler learned it from Einstein. The theory appears to have no point of origin. It pulled itself up by its bootstraps and created itself out of nothing. Well, therein lies the paradox. There are countless examples of these self-referential closed loops in media, such as in 12 Monkeys, the Terminator series, Back to the Future, Doctor Who, Game of Thrones, even Fraggle Rock. While the notion of an object or idea being trapped in a recursive time loop like this seems paradoxical to us, many scientists argue that it isn't actually a problem at all. In Futurama, for example, Fry went back in time and slept with his grandmother, thus becoming his own grandfather. However, he was always his own grandfather. Nothing in the causal chain of events was broken or changed, and the only paradox comes from how the original Fry could have come into existence in the first place. But because each iteration of the time loop is identical, it can be argued that such a time loop is self-sufficient and consistent with the laws of physics. Now this becomes a little less clear when an object is part of the time loop rather than an idea or action. In the 1980 film Somewhere in Time, for example, an old woman gives Christopher Reeve a pocket watch. He later travels back in time and gives the pocket watch to Jane Seymour, playing the same character as the old woman before inadvertently returning to the present. The difference in this scenario is that the watch should be continually aging as it travels through each iteration of the loop. There are proposals for how this might still be possible, though they tend to involve a lot of complicated thermodynamics. For the purposes of storytelling, most writers choose to have the object be something like a letter that gets worn over time and is rewritten on fresh paper before being taken back in time, thus eliminating these concerns. While these time loops are paradoxical because they have an idea or object that seems to have created itself, many scientists and philosophers alike agree that the bootstrap paradox doesn't create a logical impossibility despite being really, really weird. But some time travel paradoxes present much bigger problems. The bootstrap paradox preserves the chain of causality, but in the grandfather paradox, we throw that entirely out the window. This paradox gets its name from the most common example of breaking causality, which is going back in time and killing your own grandfather before your parent is born. If you kill your grandfather, then you will never be born, but if you were never born, then your grandfather won't be killed and thus you will be born. Not only is this logically inconsistent, but it is also an example of reverse causation, which should not be possible. Normally, a cause results in an effect, but in the paradox, the cause results in the effect negating the cause. And if you happen to like your grandfather, there's the famous variant in which you go back in time to kill baby Hitler instead. This creates a similar problem, because if Hitler was dead at the time, then he wouldn't have done all that stuff that made you want to go back in time and kill him in the first place, nor would you have any knowledge of it. As such, you wouldn't go back in time to kill him, and he would rise to power, and so on. Should something like the grandfather paradox come to pass, we have no idea what would happen. The bootstrap paradox is weird, but it is still consistent. The grandfather paradox creates an inconsistency, and there is absolutely no consensus on how such an event could be handled. But there are a lot of theories. One popular theory is the idea of infinite parallel universes. If you go back in time, some would argue that you're not going back to your own timeline, rather you're going back to that point in a different universe. As such, the actions you take there would not break the chain of causality that had previously existed in your universe. Another theory is that the universe simply will not allow actions to take place in the past that would change the future. If you tried to change the past, the universe will employ comic book logic to prevent you from actually doing so. For example, if you go to the past to try and shoot your grandfather, the gun will jam, or if it didn't jam and you shot him, then you never saw the body. Or if you did see the body, then it wasn't really him, it was a robot or a clone or something like that, comic book logic. Or if somehow you actually succeeded in killing your grandfather, then it would turn out that he was never really your grandfather in the first place. Your parent was born because your grandmother had an affair, or you were actually adopted and your entire family kept it a secret your whole life. No matter how ridiculous the end scenario, the theory speculates that the universe would ensure that no actions you took in the past could result in reverse causation. So, well, why is this paradox important? Why are honest-to-God scientists spending so much real time and effort debating what, on the surface, seems like a ridiculous paradox? And the answer to that is that general relativity is pretty great. While it may be incomplete, general relativity has shown to be incredibly consistent at making accurate predictions about the universe around us. And according to general relativity, reverse time travel should theoretically be possible. Not only that, but in 1949, Gödel produced a solution to the Einstein field equations. His solution for the equations resulted in a model of spacetime that would inevitably create closed time-like curves. His wasn't the only solution to the field equations, but the notion that physics allows for reverse time travel is pretty consistent. As a result, any time travel paradox is of particular concern to physicists, no matter how ludicrous it may sound, as it could have very real implications on the universe around us. The Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea is famous for his 9 paradoxes. The most famous of these are the dichotomy argument, the arrow in flight, and Achilles and the tortoise. But since they're all very similar and all relate to motion, we'll stick with just the dichotomy argument. The argument states that which is in locomotion must arrive at the halfway stage before it arrives at its goal. That certainly makes sense and seems to be obviously true, but let's take this argument a little further, like Zeno did. Let's say you want to run a mile. Before you finish the mile, you must run half a mile. But before you can finish the second half mile, you must run a quarter of a mile, then an eighth, then a 16th, and so on. The remaining distance can be divided in half an infinite number of times, so the runner must complete an infinite number of tasks before arriving at the destination. According to Zeno, this means that it would be impossible to arrive at a destination because doing so requires a person to complete an infinite number of tasks in a finite amount of time, which can't be done. Similarly, this argument could apply to the start of the journey as well. Instead of dividing the second mile, we can divide the first. Before reaching the half-mile point, the runner must reach the quarter mile, the eighth of a mile, and so on. Extending the infinite divisions this way, it would be impossible for the runner to ever start or stop running. Zeno argued then that all motion must be an illusion. In his writings, the Greek philosopher Simplicius wrote that upon hearing Zeno's argument, the aptly named Diogenes the Cynic stood up and walked around, disproving the idea that motion was impossible. Now, of course, this story is almost certainly apocryphal. Zeno was only 11 years old when Diogenes died, and Simplicius was writing about it several centuries later. But even if this story isn't true, it still makes a really valid point. Motion is real. However, to properly solve these paradoxes, it isn't good enough to show that the conclusion is incorrect. We need to show what exactly in the arguments is incorrect that caused the false conclusion. This is where Zeno's paradoxes become much more interesting. The conclusions seem fairly ridiculous, but the arguments seem perfectly sound. Or at the very least, they appear to be mathematically sound. Thousands of years of debate over Zeno's paradox have had some pretty profound impacts on maths and philosophy. It has caused people to question how we think about the relationship between pure mathematics and the real physical world. It also helped lead to the development of calculus, which deals heavily with infinite sequences and introduced the idea of limits. Zeno's paradoxes are so foundational to modern maths and science that there are multiple phenomena in physics named after them, such as Zeno behavior and the quantum Zeno effect. A man has been sentenced to death for one reason or another.
First time.
The judge told the condemned, "You will be executed at noon on one weekday during the following week, but which day will be a surprise to you. You will not know the day of your hanging until the executioner knocks on your door at noon that day." Now, that's a depressing verdict to be told, but after being taken back to his cell and given time to reflect, the prisoner was delighted to realize that he would escape his execution because a surprise hanging was impossible. First, the prisoner concluded that it was impossible to be hanged on a Friday. If he was still alive after noon on Thursday, then the date of the execution could be deduced with absolute certainty. Following this logic, the prisoner realized that the execution couldn't take place on Thursday either. Friday already wasn't an option, so if the executioner hadn't knocked on his door by noon on Wednesday, then the execution would have to take place on Thursday. Since this could be deduced, it would again not be a surprise. Extending this logic out further, the prisoner was able to eliminate Wednesday, Tuesday, and Monday as options for the same reason. He realized that there was no way to carry out the sentence, and so he would have to be let free at the end of the week. At noon on Wednesday, much to the surprise of the prisoner, the executioner knocked on the door for the hanging.
This is the newest of the paradoxes that we've looked at today, first coming to public attention thanks to a 1963 issue of Scientific American, though the paradox had been discussed since at least the 1940s. The paradox stems from the fact that while the prisoner was able to logically eliminate all possible days as being the date of his execution, the result was that an execution on any day became a surprise. There have been dozens of papers written about this paradox, but there's no agreed upon resolution. One of the issues is the somewhat vague language and assumptions being made. First, the term surprised is somewhat subjective. There is also the possibility that the judge is lying, that future psychological stress could reduce the prisoner's certainty of his initial conclusion, and other more opaque factors. While the arguments over semantics and definitions are relevant, the more common argument is that the prisoner's logic doesn't extend beyond the last day. Rather than focusing on the definition of the word surprise, the judge's decision can be reworded as the prisoner will be hanged next week, and the date will not be deducible the night before from the assumption that the hanging will occur during the week. This change in wording means that being hung on a Thursday would still be a surprise, as it could not be deduced on Wednesday solely from the knowledge that it would occur at some point during the week. As of Wednesday night, there were still two options available for the date, and there was no way to definitively conclude which date the execution would take place on. It is only on Thursday night that the original statement becomes contradictory, and then it would be possible to deduce the date of the hanging. Now, if that still sounds a little confusing, think of extending the sentence out to 100 days instead of just 5. While the final day would not be a surprise, and it would certainly become less of a surprise as it reached the last week or so, it becomes much more intuitive that the prisoner's original conclusion shouldn't hold. The execution can still never be on the last day, but trying to reason that none of the other 99 days would be a surprise is a bit more difficult. Instead of extending the sentence to 100 possible days, other potential resolutions attempt to limit the sentence to a single Monday, which the judge still claims the prisoner will not be able to predict. Unlike the other paradoxes that we talked about, this one has yet to show any practical applications. That may be because it's so much newer, or it could be because it relies on a lot of vaguely defined terms within the original story. Either way, the prisoner probably should have stopped being so confident in his logic and filed an appeal or something.
Just before we end today's video, for those of you who missed it earlier, please don't forget to check out today's fantastic sponsor. That's Tiege Hanley. You'll get 30% off your first box and a free gift from them by clicking the link below. And thank you for watching.
Malagamorara. Humans have used lead a bunch of different ways throughout history. Ancient Romans used it to artificially sweeten their wine, and modern dentists use it to shield your torso while they x-ray your mouth. And of course, alchemists tried very hard to turn it into gold. But it turns out, nature does kind of the opposite. Because if you look at the periodic table, every element beyond lead is radioactive. Their atoms are unstable, and the vast majority of those atoms will eventually, if given enough time, decay into lead. And they'll stay that way because lead isn't just stable, it's magic. But I'm not using that word to reference the alchemists of yestercentury. Modern scientists call lead and many other elements magic. And lucky for us, it can be explained with science. Now, before we get to any magic, we should start with some nuclear physics basics. The nucleus of an atom is made up of particles collectively called nucleons. You may know them better as protons and neutrons. It's the number of protons that determines which element an atom is. Every atom that has 82 protons is a lead atom, no matter how many neutrons it has. But different isotopes of the same element have different numbers of neutrons. And when we talk about them, we use both the element name and the total number of nucleons an isotope has. Lead-208 has the requisite 82 protons plus 126 neutrons. Lead-206, meanwhile, only has 124 neutrons. And no matter what element you're dealing with, a given isotope is either stable, meaning you can set a proverbial lump of it on your desk and it'll stay that element forever, or it's radioactive, meaning you probably shouldn't have a lump of any size of it sitting on your desk. Sooner or later, the atoms will all decay, and as they do, they release radiation and often turn into a whole different element. The two types of radioactive decay we're going to focus on today are called alpha and beta. Alpha decay is when a nucleus emits an alpha particle, which is made of 2 protons and 2 neutrons. It's basically the same thing as a helium-4 nucleus. And during beta decay, the unstable isotope emits a beta particle, which is either an electron or a positron depending on the exact kind of beta decay you're dealing with. The most common kind converts 1 neutron to a proton and releases a couple of other particles we don't really care about for the topic of this video. Both alpha and beta decay change the number of protons in the nucleus, and therefore the element. Meanwhile, only alpha decay changes the total number of nucleons. But you often find that one single decay, either alpha or beta, isn't enough for an unstable nucleus to become stable. It has to do it again, but it doesn't have to stick to the same kind of decay every single time. So by putting a series of alpha and beta decays together, you can get what scientists call decay chains. And if you know what isotope you're starting with, you can consistently predict the exact steps it's going to take to wind up stable, as well as what that final stable isotope will be. The 3 main decay chains we see in nature are called the thorium series, actinium series, and the radium series, which is also known as the uranium series. These end with lead-208, lead-207, and lead-206, respectively. But these names are a bit confusing because they generally aren't named after the isotope you actually start with. And on top of that, different isotopes of uranium, thorium, and radium show up in all 3 series. So to make things a little clearer, let's look at the thorium decay chain. It starts with the isotope thorium-232, which is less unstable than a lot of radioactive elements out there. It has a half-life of about 14 billion years, which means if you ignored my instructions and plopped a lump of pure thorium-232 on your desk, half of the atoms will no longer be thorium-232 when you go back to check in 14 billion years from now. But we don't have to wait for half. We just need 1 nucleus to decay. And when it does, it'll spit out an alpha particle, turning itself into radium-228. Then it beta decays twice, first to actinium-228 and then to thorium-228. And then 4 alpha decays later, it reaches lead-212. But we're not done yet, because that's radioactive lead. So it beta decays to bismuth-212. Then it has a proverbial choice. Sometimes it goes the alpha decay route, sometimes it goes with beta decay. But either way, the nucleus does the other one next. and we wind up with lead-208. Now, having walked through all of that, I should admit that there is a fourth decay chain that doesn't end with lead, the neptunium chain. But the isotopes in this chain have such short half-lives, they've already gone through most of the steps. Scientists say it's extinct in nature, except for the very last step. The second to last isotope in the chain is bismuth-209, which has a half-life of nearly 20 quintillion years, which is 1.4 billion times the age of the universe. But if we fast forward to the very far future, the final step in this chain is thallium-205. And there's a couple other exceptions to lead being the ultimate fate for a radioactive nucleus too, like all the atoms that start with fewer nucleons than any lead isotope. Or the fact that sometimes a supermassive nucleus that could become lead doesn't even bother with a decay chain. Instead, it undergoes this very fun reaction known as spontaneous fission, where it effectively cracks in two instead of just emitting small particles in an attempt to achieve stability. Fair enough, but that brings us to an important question. Why are some isotopes radioactive while others are stable? If we zoom in on the nucleus, the protons are all positively charged, so they repel each other. Adding neutral neutrons can compensate, but the more protons you have, the more neutrons you need to keep things stable. This leads to a pattern called the Valley of Stability. If we look at the number of neutrons and protons for all the known isotopes and plot them out in a fancy chart, we can see that the stable ones all occur along the same line. But increasing the ratio of neutrons to protons only works for so long. Eventually, the valley ends. Once you pass lead-208, everything is unstable. Everything is radioactive. But even within the Valley of Stability, you'll see there are some weird patterns. Like, why does indium, atomic number 49, only have 2 stable isotopes, but its periodic table neighbor tin has a whopping 10? Well, back in the 1940s, this particular quirk did not go unnoticed by a chemist named Maria Goupert-Mayer. While she was working on a project to map the abundance of various isotopes, she noticed that the isotopes with a particular number of either protons or neutrons were more likely to be stable. These numbers were 2, 8, 20, 28, 50, 82, and 126. She proposed this was evidence of the nuclear shell model, where protons and neutrons occupy specific energy levels inside a nucleus. You can think of them as shells, and each can hold a particular number of nucleons. When the outermost shell is completely full, the atom holds onto its nucleons tighter. That translates to the isotope having a better chance of being stable. Now, if you're wondering why all this sounds a little familiar to you, it's probably because you learned something very similar happens with electrons. Chemistry textbooks often describe electrons as orbiting the nucleus in shells, and when the outermost shell is full, the element is less reactive. This gives us the noble gases on the far right of the periodic table. They're inert because they have full outer electron shells. But while electron shells were accepted by the time Goupert-Mayer proposed her nuclear shell model, many physicists were reluctant to accept her ideas. Instead, they were using the liquid drop model, which suggests a nucleus is basically a blob of protons and neutrons. One physicist named Eugene Winger was particularly skeptical, but he couldn't deny the patterns that Goupert-Mayer had discovered. So he called these stability numbers magic numbers, because the liquid drop model couldn't explain them. But it wasn't magic, it was a revelation in nuclear physics. And Goupert-Mayer published her findings in 1948, at nearly the exact same time as the German physicist Hans Jensen was figuring the same thing out himself. But rather than this leading to an academic rivalry or the attempted erasure of a certain someone's contributions to the world of science, this story has a happy ending. They went on to work together, and in 1963, they shared the Nobel Prize in Physics. Despite not being magic, the term magic numbers stuck. And these days, the accepted ones are still those that Goupert-Mayer first identified: 2, 8, 20, 28, 50, 82, and, at least for neutrons, 126. Some scientists think that 114 is more likely to be the 7th magic number for protons, but that hasn't been proven experimentally. Either way, magic numbers explain why tin has more stable isotopes than indium. Tin has 50 protons, one of our magic numbers. But some isotopes are doubly magic, because both their proton and neutron counts are just right. The simplest is helium-4, with 2 protons and 2 neutrons. And the extreme stability of this isotope is partly why radioactive elements like thorium-232 undergo alpha decay. Because remember, alpha particles are identical to helium-4 nuclei. Now, having a magic number doesn't guarantee stability, it just makes it more likely given the other factors, like the physical size of a nucleus. For example, all isotopes of lead have 82 protons, so they're all magic. But there are still many radioactive forms of it. And then there's lead-208, which has 126 neutrons, making it doubly magic. That makes it more stable than it would otherwise be given its large size, and it winds up being the heaviest stable isotope, as far as we know. So to sum up, so many radioactive elements decay into lead because lead is magic, and one isotope of lead is doubly magic. But that's not the end of the story, because physicists are still on the lookout for new magic numbers. And which ones are actually magic is a subject for debate. Magic numbers can be predicted through theoretical calculations, but scientists have to do experiments to actually test the real-world properties and stability of a given isotope. For example, in 2013, separate studies suggested that both 32 and 34 were magic numbers. But a follow-up study in 2021 looked at 32 by measuring the size of specific potassium nuclei. If a potassium nucleus started with 32 neutrons and 32 were a magic number, you'd measure a big jump in its size if you added one more neutron. Because remember, magic numbers refer to the filled outer shells, so that 33rd neutron would have to go in a new outer shell that makes the whole nucleus bigger. But when the team actually tested this, they didn't observe that change. So they concluded that there was nothing magical about the number 32. But potassium isn't exactly new ground to explore, so it's worth highlighting that magic numbers can also help scientists extend the periodic table and predict the stability of yet-to-be-discovered elements. Everything heavier than lead-208 is radioactive, but as we go farther and farther away to heavier and heavier elements, things get very unstable. I'm talking half-lives of just milliseconds or microseconds long, max. But somewhere beyond the known elements, there's a hypothetical island of stability, a group of isotopes that could be stabilized by unconfirmed magic numbers. It would still be radioactive, but their half-lives would be longer than the other super-heavy isotopes around them. Predictions range from minutes to up to millions of years. The center of the island could be Flerovium-298, which according to some scientists would be doubly magic, with 114 protons and 184 neutrons. We've still got a ways to go though. As of 2023, the heaviest element we've synthesized is Oganesson-294, made up of 118 protons and 176 neutrons. So while they may not be real magic, magic numbers can tell us a lot about how the fundamental building blocks of our universe work. They may be the key to extending the periodic table. And they explain how a lump of gray metal that makes you sick from radiation poisoning can turn into a lump of different gray metal that makes you sick from lead poisoning without any alchemist's insight. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow, and thanks especially to everyone who supports us on Patreon. We couldn't do this without you. But is there a magic number of Patreon supporters? Well, this is a science show, so we should probably do an experiment to find out. And if you'd like to help us test that hypothesis, consider signing up today. Just head on over to patreon.com/scishow to learn more. It may be toxic, but mercury sure looks magical. So much so that, according to legend, the ancient Chinese emperor Qin Shi Huang drank it, thinking it would give him eternal life. A bit misguided, sure, but honestly, understandable. After all, it's a metal that manages to be liquid at room temperature, even if that room has a window open and it's snowing outside. I'm not exaggerating. Mercury doesn't freeze until it drops below negative 39 degrees Celsius. But as visions of mercury blobs skitter through your mind, you may be wondering why mercury is so special. Well, in order to answer that question, we have to turn to a theory you might associate with space travel more than chemistry. A theory that taught us both space and time are relative, and that E equals mc squared. That's right, mercury is a liquid because of special relativity. Let's start our exploration of all this weirdness in the shallow end of the pool, which I've filled with water, not mercury, and recall a bit of high school chemistry. The periodic table isn't just a cool thing to hang on your wall, it's a top-notch organizational device. Because elements that share a column with each other usually share some of the same properties. For example, everything in the leftmost column of the periodic table is very reactive, meaning the atoms really want to form strong bonds with one or more other atoms. In contrast, everything in the rightmost column is the opposite of reactive. You know, the noble gases. And finally, there's everything in the middle, which mostly comes in shades of sorta reactive. Mercury, you'll notice, is one of the many elements in the middle of the table. It belongs to a group of metals known as the transition metals. And it's more specifically a member of group 12, along with zinc, cadmium, and the only exists when humans make it, copernicium. But wherever you are on the table, your reactivity is generally determined by how many electrons you have and how they're arranged around the nucleus. Now, you might remember being told to picture this arrangement like so, where the electrons sit in a series of concentric circles. This setup is sometimes known as the planetary model because it vaguely resembles planets orbiting the sun. And it's wrong. Because there's this fun thing that happens when you shrink down to subatomic sizes. Electrons are revealed to not be teeny, discrete particles governed by the traditional laws of physics. They're simultaneously both particles and waves, obeying the fuzzy laws of quantum mechanics. So while electrons do orbit nuclei, it's not like how planets orbit the sun. But if we acknowledge it's wrong, we can take advantage of this model's simplicity and use it to understand why mercury is a liquid. Can we all agree on that? Okay, cool. Electrons orbit an atom's nucleus in specific locations called shells. Each shell can hold a different number of fun-looking shapes called subshells. Shell 1 can hold one type of subshell. Shell 2 can hold 2, and so on. We don't need to go into all the nuances for this video, but these subshells get more and more complicated as you go, creating more electron storage spots. For example, an S subshell has 2 spots, and a D subshell has 10 spots. So the higher the shell number, the more electrons you can pack into it. And as you learned in chem class, all these shells and subshells tend to fill up in a very specific order. But I am a benevolent host, so we're gonna skip right to the arrangement for mercury and its 80 electrons. Voila! I know it looks a bit complicated, but the most important thing to notice is that all the subshells that have any electrons are completely full. Compare this to all the other transition metals in Mercury's row, which have at least one electron missing from either their 6s subshell, their 5d subshell, or both. You see a similar feature in other group 12 elements. They don't have as many electrons to deal with, but their outermost s and d subshells are full too. And in chemistry, a set of completely filled subshells makes an atom very happy, as much as a non-sentient particle can express a human emotion. It's more correct to say that the atom is less reactive. But since that doesn't come naturally to most elements on the periodic table, the typical way for an atom to do this is by making bonds. When you're in a chemistry class, you usually think of that happening in terms of a chemical reaction, like putting a bunch of please take this electron sodium and please give me an electron chlorine together to make table salt. But those aren't the only kinds of bonds atoms can make. When you've just got a bunch of the same atoms chilling out together, like a lump of pure sodium or pool of mercury, you're working with metallic bonds. And under the right conditions, like if you crank up the thermostat, you can loosen those bonds and change a solid lump into a liquid pool. Since the group 12 elements all have that filled outer S and D subshell combo, the metallic bonds that their atoms do form will be weaker than those made by the rest of their transition metal cousins, which means they'll have noticeably lower melting points. For example, zinc melts at about 420 degrees Celsius. Well, that's scorching to you or me. It's downright chilly compared to copper next door, rocking a melting point that's over 1,000 degrees. Cadmium, meanwhile, melts a bit sooner at 320 degrees. But mercury, as I stated in the intro to this episode, will be a liquid as soon as it's warmer than negative 39 degrees Celsius. It melts before water does. As it turns out, mercury atoms are so uninterested in bonding that they mostly hold themselves together with a kind of electrostatic attraction called van der Waals forces. These forces are a lot weaker than your standard bonds and arise from the fact that at any given moment, an atom's electrons aren't evenly distributed. In other words, you have regions where there's a tiny amount of extra negative charge, and those regions can attract regions of the next atom over where the electrons don't happen to be, making them a little more positive in charge. Now, one reason why mercury is so reliant on these weak van der Waals connections is because, unlike zinc and cadmium, it's big enough to put some of its electrons into an F subshell. And if you thought D subshells looked complicated, F subshells are even more so. They can have all sorts of weird effects on an atom, including metallic bonds that are weaker than they otherwise should be. Unfortunately, this still doesn't explain why mercury's melting point is as low as it is. That's right. It's time for special relativity to step in. This was Albert Einstein's first version of relativity, and it completely re-envisioned the relationships between space and time and energy and mass. But as the name suggests, it also taught us that these properties are relative. They appear to change as an object moves relative to an observer. And one of those properties is mass. The faster you're moving relative to someone else, the more massive they measure you to be. Now, for most speeds you run into on a day-to-day basis, that increase in mass is inconsequential. It's a rounding error. So for a lot of real-world physics and a lot of chemistry, you can rely on the simplified, non-relativistic versions of equations that may have existed before Einstein came along. But as the relative speed gets faster and faster, that increase in mass can't be ignored. If you try to use the simplified equations, your answers will come out wrong. Your predictions won't match observations. And that's true whether you're a futuristic spaceship trying to ferry humans across interstellar space without them dying of old age, or you're an electron in orbit of an atom. See, the more protons you pack into an atom's nucleus, the faster the electrons will be moving around it. That's because protons are positively charged, while electrons are negatively charged. Opposite charges attract, so with more protons, there's a stronger pull toward the nucleus. Now, due to quantum shenanigans like the whole particle wave duality thing, the electrons are still stuck occupying those shells I talked about earlier. They don't spiral down toward the nucleus, they merely increase their velocity. So if we look at Mercury with its 80 protons, we see so much attraction that the two electrons in its innermost shell are moving a little over half the speed of light. And half the speed of light is too fast to ignore the rules of special relativity. The electrons get a boost in mass, and that boost causes several of the subshells to contract. The mercury atoms get smaller. And remember, we've got a big positively charged nucleus tugging negatively charged electrons. So if everything's a bit closer together, the atom is going to hold on to its electrons a bit more tightly. And that means it'll be even more non-reactive than it was before you accounted for relativity, which mercury, of course, did already have going for it. It's a group 12 transition metal with completely filled shells, just like its siblings zinc and cadmium. But zinc only has 30 protons and cadmium has 48. You can get away with ignoring the effects of relativity when you've only got 48 protons. you can't with 80. Or at least that was the hypothesis that started forming back in the 1970s. If scientists wanted to prove that special relativity could explain Mercury's especially low melting point, they'd need a computer that could handle the simulations they'd need to run. Or more accurately, the two sets of simulations they'd need to run. The first set would create a bunch of digital Mercury atoms and keep track of all the interactions between them according to these simplified, non-relativistic versions of our physics equations. Meanwhile, the second set would instruct the atoms to obey the more complex relativistic equations. If the two simulations produced wildly different melting points, with the relativistic one producing a temperature close to what we observe in the real world, the researchers would know that they were onto something. But that's easier said than done. It's hard enough getting a computer to accurately simulate 3 interacting bodies, let alone a few dozen. But finally, in 2013, a team of researchers were able to simulate a whopping 55 atoms of mercury. When they ignored relativity, the melting point was 82 degrees Celsius. That's fairly low for a metal, but nowhere near what it should be. But when they took the effects of relativity into account, the melting point dropped to negative 23 degrees. It isn't quite the negative 39 we see in the real world, but it's way closer. In fact, it's close enough to safely conclude that the puzzle behind Mercury's sloshy nature has been solved. Still, best if you don't drink it though. This episode of SciShow is brought to you by you, or some of you, our Patreon supporters. Thanks to them, we can keep the lights on, the cameras rolling, the pre- and post-production teams typing and clicking away on their keyboards. Really, this support is so very important. And if you want to be part of this awesome group of people, head over to patreon.com/scishow. We've tried and failed to go to Mars so many times. Don't get me wrong, we have completed successful missions to Mars. I mean, it's right next door. So we've racked up both victories and let's call them learning opportunities. But the sheer number of attempts may or may not excuse the fact that half of Mars missions fail. There must be something about Mars that makes it really hard to get to. And that's the Martian mystery we're about to dive into, along with the cool innovations bringing up our success rate. So, to get you settled in, here's why it's so hard to land on Mars. Thanks to its watery history and potential for past life, Mars has been fascinating people for decades. So it's no surprise that we've sent more spacecraft there than any other planet. We're talking 45 missions. Most other worlds have had just a small handful. The problem is, around half of the probes that have ever attempted to explore Mars have either crashed or disappeared. So as much as we want to understand the planet, getting to its surface is no easy feat. Mars's unique atmosphere often gets the better of us, and it's taken some creative engineering to get to the ground. Before Mars, the only places we'd ever landed spacecraft were the Moon and Earth. And while that did come with challenges, we had strategies nailed down pretty well for both. The hard thing about landing on Earth is that our thick atmosphere creates extreme friction and heat with incoming spacecraft. But we've solved that problem with heat shields. And besides, that thick atmosphere also means parachutes work very well. The Moon is kind of the opposite. It has virtually no atmosphere, which gets rid of the heat problem, but it also means parachutes don't work. We have to use retro rockets to land, little rockets that fire underneath the spacecraft to slow its descent. Mars, meanwhile, is a whole different beast. It comes with all the challenges of landing on Earth and the Moon, but with none of the real benefits. Its atmosphere is 100 times thinner than Earth's, meaning parachutes can't grab onto enough air to completely slow down the spacecraft. But unlike the moon, there's also just enough atmosphere to create problems. Just like friction causes space rocks and old satellites to burn up in Earth's atmosphere, a space probe entering Mars's atmosphere can get hotter than 2,000 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to melt iron and just about every other metal. So the millions of dollars worth of machinery we send to Mars needs serious protection to keep from being fried. So, how do you get an expensive, heavy chunk of metal traveling tens of thousands of kilometers an hour to come gently to a stop on the surface of another world? A whole lot of creativity. And probably a good amount of coffee. Every mission to land on Mars starts with something called an aeroshell, a special capsule that protects its cargo against the heat. Its outer layer is filled with a material called an ablator that was invented in the 1970s for the first Mars landers, the Viking missions. It reacts with the Martian atmosphere in a way that removes the heat and leaves behind a trail of gas. It gets so hot that it glows red, but inside the capsule, cargo stays a little cooler than room temperature. Next, once friction has slowed things to about 1,600 kilometers per hour, a parachute opens, and part of the aeroshell is cast off. Amazingly, engineers are still using a parachute pretty similar to the one designed for the Viking landers more than 40 years ago. It's made of nylon and polyester, with tethers made of the same material as bulletproof vests. That makes it super strong and light, which is really important, considering the craft is still moving at supersonic speeds when it deploys. And while it isn't enough to slow down a spacecraft all the way, it does help. After a few minutes, the parachute brings the craft down to a few hundred kilometers per hour, and it gets discarded along with the rest of the aeroshell. Now, this is where things get really creative, and no type of mission has been exactly the same. Engineers have had to come up with special solutions to get each spacecraft on the ground. For example, those 1970s Viking landers used retro rockets like on the moon. But there was always the possibility that they'd botch a landing on uneven ground. And while they were fine for landers, carrying around a bunch of rockets would be a pointless burden on the rovers we started sending to Mars in the 90s. So for the Pathfinder mission that landed in 1997, which included the first experimental rover, engineers tried a new method: a cluster of airbags. After slamming into the ground, this robotic explorer bounced along for hundreds of meters. And by bounced, I mean it shot several stories into the air and moved as fast as cars on the freeway before rolling to a stop. But somehow it worked. In fact, it worked so well that scientists used the same system to land the more recent Spirit and Opportunity rovers. Then, in 2012, things had to change again, because airbags were out of the question for the Curiosity rover. It was nearly 5 times the mass of Spirit and Opportunity, so engineers came up with their most epic solution yet. They called it a sky crane. Basically, it was a stage that used retro rockets to hover above the surface. From there, it slowly lowered the rover on a tether, then cut itself free and flew off to crash land nearby. NASA's next Mars mission, Mars 2020, will use a similar strategy. But who knows what kind of unique designs we'll see after that. Oh, and in case this all isn't complicated enough, every single step of these landings also has to happen completely automatically. That's because radio signals travel at the speed of light, so they take at least 8 minutes to go from Earth to Mars and back, which is longer than it takes to land. And it's not exactly easy to put a spacecraft on autopilot in a world that's still really foreign and unpredictable. The good news is, all these years of work have been well worth it. Besides preparing us for future exploration, these landers have brought us closer to knowing what Mars was like in the past. That could help us figure out whether or not it ever hosted life, and what it would take to support human life one day in the future. And it's all thanks to some brilliant engineers and organizations. As it turns out, there's a lot of factors making Mars's surface tough to touch down on. But ultimately, we have surpassed these obstacles and landed there. Here's Caitlin to tell us what it took to do it the very first time.
Before every Mars landing, there's a tense period of radio silence between the moment the spacecraft hurtles into the atmosphere and the moment it touches down. During what's now known as the 7 minutes of terror, the spacecraft slows from several kilometers per second to a complete stop, all on its own. These days, scientists have the help of sophisticated computers, AI, and fancy gadgets like self-piloting sky cranes. But back when scientists made the first successful landing on Mars, those minutes of silence were especially terrifying. That first landing didn't earn a big place in history books, and yet the strategy behind it paved the way for many truly historic missions to Mars. This was all back in May of 1971 when Soviets launched the Mars 3 mission, which included a lander and an orbiter. It launched just days after its twin, Mars 2, and set off on the 6-month journey to Mars. The plan was for the orbiters to take photos of the Martian surface from on high and return information about things like topography and magnetic fields. They'd also relay communications from the landers to Earth. Meanwhile, the landers would take pictures from the surface and measure properties like wind speed, air pressure, and temperature. They even contained an itty-bitty rover on skis that would study the soil. That might all sound like a tall order, considering that at this point, the Soviet Union hadn't even done a flyby of Mars, but they'd done some similar science on the moon. So these types of experiments weren't entirely new. The part that was new was the landing. And landing on Mars is not easy. The first problem is that its atmosphere is super thin. Spacecraft are traveling several kilometers a second when they arrive, so they need to slow down a lot. But a parachute isn't that effective when it doesn't have a lot of air to grab onto. Unfortunately, the atmosphere is also still thick enough that the spacecraft will burn up if they're not carefully protected. And the whole descent has to happen automatically, because a spacecraft gets all the way to the ground faster than a single signal can travel from Earth. So it's all on its own, and if the slightest thing goes wrong, a Mars landing can be doomed. That's what happened with Mars 2. It entered the atmosphere at too steep of an angle and plunged straight into the surface. But it did earn the honor of being the first spacecraft to reach the surface of Mars, technically. And a few days later, its twin became the first to stick the landing. Mars 3 got off to a better start. After it split ways with its orbiter, it entered the atmosphere at a super shallow angle, less than 10 degrees. That made it possible for Mars 3 to take advantage of a technique called aerobraking. Basically, it used the drag from the atmosphere to help it slow down. Then it deployed 2 parachutes, starting with a small pilot chute, then a larger main chute. The main chute would tear if it opened too soon, so at first, a cord around the base kept it from fully inflating, in a technique called reefing. Then, once it got below supersonic speeds, it popped open. At this point, the altimeter turned on. That's a tool that uses light to calculate distance by bouncing radar signals off the ground and measuring their return time. And using this, the descent module could kick off its final landing sequence right before it hit the ground. By then, it was still going more than 60 meters per second. So a split second away from disaster, it tossed off its parachute and fired its retro rockets. Even so, it slammed into the ground at more than 20 meters per second, or about 45 miles per hour. But it was designed to. Shock absorbers inside protected the cargo, and when everything came to a stop, 4 petal-like hatches opened to reveal the lander. Unfortunately, it only transmitted for 20 seconds and sent back a grand total of 1 grainy image. As far as we can tell, it had the misfortune of landing in a severe dust storm, and that may have done it in. So Mars 3 never really went down in history, but in a lot of ways, it was an important success. For one, the orbiter sent back pictures of the surface, revealing huge Martian mountains and providing the data for topographical maps. And it collected data about the atmosphere, gravity, and magnetic fields of the red planet. But the lander was important too. Not only did it mark a milestone and prove that we could land on Mars, it taught us how. It showed us how a bunch of sophisticated automatic maneuvers could be combined to pull off a pretty soft landing. And while it's not simple, this sequence of steps replaced the need for lots of heavy fuel and other landing gear that might overburden the craft. These days, the basic steps for landing on Mars are mostly the same. Recent missions also used aerobraking, parachutes, retro rockets, and radar to make their way to the surface. The main difference is that as payloads have gotten heavier, engineers have designed bundles of airbags and elaborate sky cranes to assist with the final touchdown. By now, humans have pulled off Mars landings 10 different times in the last half century. And while Mars 3 didn't give us glamorous photos or discoveries to remember it by, its success is embedded in every single mission that comes after it.
After 7 minutes of terror, we managed to land on Mars. And only a special kind of person would hear the phrase 7 minutes of terror and think, Let's do that again. So it's a big deal to perform another liftoff after landing. But when the alternative is trying to get over the extreme terrain to explore the red planet, sometimes another launch is the best option. In this case, it's a much smaller craft. Okay, it's a drone, but technically, this was the first helicopter on Mars. And back in 2017, Hank was in the throes of the suspenseful lead-up to that launch.
Over the last 50 years, we've sent tons of cool spacecraft to Mars. Flybys, orbiters, landers, rovers. Seems like we've done everything. Still, there's one kind of mission that we have not done yet. No Mars mission has flown through the air. But that might change in just a few years. Nothing's final yet, but engineers are experimenting with the idea of including a drone called the Mars Helicopter on the upcoming Mars 2020 rover. Mars 2020 is NASA's successor to Curiosity, and it's expected to launch in, you guessed it, 2020. It has a similar design to Curiosity and will study potentially habitable environments. It will also select and package samples that we could return to Earth on a future mission. Adding a helicopter could help this rover overcome one of Curiosity's biggest problems. It just doesn't go that far. Curiosity's been on Mars for over 5 years, but in that time, it's only driven about 17.5 kilometers, or an average of less than 10 meters per day. Part of that is because the rover stops and studies things, but it's also because driving a rover on another planet is pretty dang hard. Radio communication with Mars takes anywhere from 8 to 48 minutes round trip, depending on where the Earth and Mars are in their orbits. So mission controllers can't just drive Curiosity Mario Kart style. It can steer itself across simple terrain like a self-driving car, but it still needs to stop every now and again to get input from Earth, and there are some kinds of rocky or difficult terrain that it just can't handle. Picking Curiosity's path isn't always the easiest either. To decide where it should go, engineers rely on pictures from the rover and from satellites in orbit, but Curiosity's cameras can only see so far, and the satellites have a top-down view, so they can't always see the true shape of surface features. If Mars 2020 could launch a drone to scout out the area ahead, it could anticipate obstacles and identify the most interesting things to study, and someday, a Mars helicopter or Marscopter might even be able to explore places a rover couldn't reach, like small channels or cliffs. This all sounds like an amazing idea, but there is a big problem. Mars is not a very good place to fly. Helicopters stay in the air because they experience lift, or more pressure underneath them than above them, and the more dense the air is, the more lift your helicopter can get because there's more air molecules for it to push against. The problem is, Mars's atmosphere is really thin, like less than a 60th of the density of Earth's atmosphere at sea level, so it's a lot harder to create lift. But good news, there's less gravity, so that's one thing working in favor for us, but it is not enough to counteract just the lack of molecules to push against. For this to work, engineers would have to give their Marscopter extra long rotor blades. Basically, this would let the helicopter push against more air molecules at once, even if they're spread farther apart. To carry just 1 kilogram across the Martian surface, the Mars helicopter would need rotors more than a meter across, which is a lot bigger than your neighbor's photography drone. And that doesn't mean the drone could carry 1 kilogram of samples either. Everything from the rotors to the flight computer to the solar panels would have to add up to 1 kilogram of mass. But amazingly, getting airborne might actually be one of the easiest parts of a Mars helicopter. Remember that communications delay between Earth and Mars? Well, unlike a rover, which can sit around and wait for instructions, once the Mars helicopter is airborne, clock's ticking. It would probably fly for 2 to